Thank you for joining us today for Caliber Leadership Systems' first in a series of webinars on dysfunctional leadership styles, how to change the behavior of a narcissistic leader. Over our 25 plus years of working closely with executive teams and individual leaders on behavioral change, leadership, and organizational development, combined with our research on personality styles, neuroscience, and the emotional drivers of behavior, we have come to identify 4 distinct dysfunctional leadership styles. Each has its own challenges as well as path towards development. Each represents a different negative impact on the organizations in which they lead, impacts that often can lead to dysfunction within the organization or even just a failure to achieve the true potential of the organization. We chose to start with the narcissistic leader as their impact is felt strongly by those who work with them. This webinar is part 3 on the narcissistic leader. The first webinar identified the 6 signs that you are in fact working with a narcissistic leader. The second provided you with 4 key ways to survive working for or with a narcissistic leader. Finally, part 3 tackles how to actually change their behavior as it is possible. It is our hope when you have completed our 3 webinars on narcissistic leaders that you will be able to identify them by their behavior and impact, know how to deal with them personally to minimize their impact on you, and to understand what it takes to actually change their behavior. They bring great strengths to our organizations, so shifting them out of their dysfunctional behavioral patterns is key to getting the most from these leaders. There's a lot of confusion about the differences between people who are narcissistic versus those who have a narcissistic personality disorder. The narcissistic leader is not mentally ill, does not have a personality disorder, and is most interested in gaining power, money, and prestige. They may act the same and seem indistinguishable to those with an actual personality disorder for most people. However, their self-esteem is not as fragile, and they are actually able to develop new behaviors. They seem the same because they use the same dysfunctional behaviors to achieve their agenda. In part 1, we detail the characteristics of the narcissistic leader. So here, just to recap, focused on gaining power, money, and prestige, shrewd in their dealings with others, and very, very competitive. They have a phenomenal belief in themselves. However, they lack empathy and are unable to demonstrate compassion for another's situation. They are preoccupied with envy and where it is that they are relative to others. However, and importantly, especially as it relates to this particular webinar, they are able to develop new behaviors. We're just going to share with you the 4 rules to keep in mind about how we go about changing the behavior of a narcissistic leader. So rule number 1, traditional training and coaching does not work. So one of the things that often happens to these leaders is they get sent out to take a leadership course. But it's really important to understand that this doesn't even come close to touching them or having them change their behavior. We often use the expression, I think, therefore I am, when it comes to this particular dysfunctional leadership style. And what we mean by that is they already think they're great leaders. And so going to a course is simply going to reinforce that they already know how to do everything and they're already doing everything right. There's a disconnect between how they perceive themselves and what is actually going on in the experience and in reality. And so we need to actually use a combination of empathic support and training and how we work with others. That's what can most help a narcissistic manager to contain some of the most damaging manifestations of narcissism. It takes patience and endurance in order to develop trust. And so the coaching process is going to take longer. This is not a quick hit intervention. This is something where you have to plan out that it's going to take a long time for coaching to work. However, of all of the methods for coaching someone or developing and changing their behavior, individual coaching is absolutely the one that has the highest success rate. If there's any pressure at all from the coach to conform to them or to their process, the narcissistic leader will take a self-protective stance and make absolutely no progress. So there's a very, very delicate balance, and sometimes we can see the narcissistic leader making progress with coaching only then to shut it down and make themselves unavailable for the coaching process. So be prepared for the fact that the kind of coach you have to bring on board to work with these individuals has to have specialized expertise in working with this particular self-protective system. Okay? So again, thinking about it from looking at coaching and having a coach that's adaptable enough to really sort of make those mid-game adjustments, and it's going to move more slowly. I want to reinforce that because a lot of times organizations want to rush the change process around these individuals, but it's really not appropriate, because the second we panic the narcissistic leader, they become more self-protective. Okay? So it takes patience, it takes time, but we can actually move the narcissistic leader then towards real growth. Rule number 2, assess, and assess again. So really what's useful when we're dealing with changing the behavior of the narcissistic leader is to bring reality in front of them again and again and again, because it's harder for them to argue with the feedback that they gain through an effective 360 process or other mechanism that helps them explore and build up their level of self-awareness. So again, their self-concept is very, very high. And so their perception of their self is as a great leader, but that's not the reality of the experience. And so assessments like 360 process really help us to bring reality front and center so that they can work with that. They may move to dismiss it, but at the end of the day, it gives the coach and that individual and even the individual's boss a place of focusing the energy and the effort in terms of the development process. Okay, so development is when we're looking at but using behavioral modification here, we want them to be aware of the consequences of their actions and give them other ways to handle situations. So the 360-degree process sometimes is enough to boundary the behavior of the narcissistic leader because they want to look good, and so then they learn to manage their behavior in order to have a different outcome in the 360 process. So it can serve both as a direction but also as a boundary, which is very, very important to them. So rule number 3 when we're looking at changing the behavior of the narcissistic leader is we talk about it in the context of protecting the organization. It is really important that we don't put insecure or inexperienced people underneath them, but also that we are using in the recruitment process and in the promotion processes, we look for signs of narcissism. Psychometric assessments can be really helpful in flagging the narcissistic leaders. And how does this relate to developing their behavior? Well, if we put them in the right context, if we organize them relative to the impact that they are going to have, then we can actually help to protect the organization, which is really what we're looking for in terms of making the most out of this particular dysfunctional leadership style. And I'll give you a couple of examples here. So in one organization, what we did in the development process for the CEO was we actually put a layer and his executive team underneath him so that his impact on the organization was limited to working with that particular executive team. And how that helped was that the rest of the executive team we could work to support to develop up in terms of their ability of working with that particularly narcissistic CEO, and it was allowing them then therefore limiting the impact of some of his behavior and some of his impacts on the rest of the organization. In another case, we actually split the organization. So this narcissistic leader was really focused on a smaller span of control that allowed them to stay in their own comfort zone zone, which was less likely to trigger some of the self-protective behaviors. And so a lot of the people management side of the business was actually moved out to another individual. So again, it allowed the narcissistic leader to stay in control where it was within their comfort zone and their skill set, while still bringing others into the fold to really help the overall success of the organization. So we're looking again at this from a couple of different fronts: is how do we boundary, but how do we create the context? Because we have to keep in mind always that when we're looking at the behavior of the narcissistic leader, it is a self-protective system that's being triggered in them, these behaviors, or a defensive set of behaviors. And so what is it in their context that might be triggering this, and can we protect the organization by making changes relative to that? Ties in very closely to number 4, which is really limiting their impact. And so if the narcissistic leader is just completely unable to self-manage, it really is critical to take steps to reduce their sphere of influence. So this can be setting up processes where other people are involved with strategic decisions. This can be about allowing and ensuring that there's delegation to lower level managers to take responsibility for more routine concerns, to kind of, again, unlocks the potential of the organization by shifting the span of control of the particular narcissistic leader. So introducing the use of cross-functional committees, task force, executive committees, these all provide opportunities that force a level of collaboration and cooperation that the narcissistic leader themselves may not be driving. The other thing to do is thinking about bringing in, and we've done this a fair bit, where we bring in a particular system or a way of doing things that allows the narcissistic leader to look great because they're the one that's brought it in. But in essence, what we've done is delegated a lot of the business decision making and the business operation through that particular system or process. So they get to stay in control because they like the system and the way the system works for them, but at the same time they're not as directly involved, and so they don't have the same interpersonal impact on the people around them. And so again, this can, we're while we may not be directly changing the behavior, we are changing it by supporting them, accepting their limitations, and then looking at other ways through organizational design, through systems and processes and other practices where we really limit the impact and support them to be ultimately productive in their particular roles. It is important to remember that they are able to change their behavior, but we have to say that of all of the styles, this can sometimes be the one that is most difficult to develop up, because it requires them to actually recognize the need for help. So in order to be helped, they have to first accept the fact. And a lot of the times we find when we end up working with narcissistic leaders, it's because their boss has brought us in to deal with that particular individual. And of course, they don't necessarily think there's anything wrong with them. As one of them said, when I was saying that, this is a privilege to have this investment being made in him, he said, no, I'm just being treated like the problem child and you're in here to fix me. And so that's their natural perception, is to be quite resistant to the development process. So they have to recognize the need for help. And again, a lot of the times we'll appeal to is this where you want to get stopped in your career? Is this how you want to be perceived? And finding that thing that will help them recognize the need for them to get help and allow someone to actually get in close enough to really help them break free from their limitations, because it is so difficult. As we said in the second webinar, it's really, really difficult to get near to them. Equally though, as we talk about changing the behavior of the narcissistic leader, it is important to acknowledge when they just won't, or they can't, depending on how you want to characterize it. But we do run into situations where they are so locked into that defensive position that it is everyone else's fault, and that there's nothing wrong with them, and that it's just that everybody else needs to change, that we sometimes have to accept the fact that the cost to the organization of their particular behavior far outweighs the benefits of the strengths and the capabilities that they bring. So it is important to acknowledge when they won't, and when we can't adapt or work around or make other changes to the context of the organization in order to support their success. So thank you for joining us today. I encourage you to learn more about the Narcissistic Leader, the 6 signs in Webinar 1, or the 4 tips for surviving them in Webinar 2. Or certainly check out more of our webinars on our Dysfunctional Leadership series. We work with individuals and organizations globally to drive behavioral change and maximize organizational performance. I encourage you to contact us for a free consult or to get more practical insights by signing up with our newsletter. And if you want to really understand what actually drives behavior and to find out which of the 4 dysfunctional leadership styles you're most likely to shift into when you're working out of your self-protective system, I encourage you to purchase our book, Who Are You Meant to Be? Thanks again for joining us today.